The Ogroni awoke with a start. One moment they were asleep at the base of a stone shrine, attempting to sleep off some of the pain they had experienced earlier. The next, they felt the chill of cold metal run across their backs. They were quick to rise and quicker to get their weapons ready. But after an attack failed to materialize, they decided to look around their new surroundings. The designs of the surfaces and furniture were completely alien to them, as were the proportions and layout of the various rooms and hallways, with each one being different from the next. The only similarity between them was the unpleasantly bright lights and a number of small boxes located in the upper corners of the room. Their walk continued uninterrupted until they were met initially by a singular figure, a human woman wearing what Norio had assumed was her idea of clothes, who spread her arms wide at the sight of them in some kind of greeting. But as the group drew closer to greet her, an unwelcome sight moved in behind her. The spineless curs from before, the exact ones who had shot at them from behind like savage beasts. The memories of the fight not long before, coupled with their readied weapons, stopped them in their tracks. Norio could hear a low growl from Naoki, getting ready to respond in kind. He held a hand out and glared at her.
"No, not here," he said sternly.
Naoki stood down hesitantly, and the opposing leader did the same, signaling his men to lower their weapons. The woman, meanwhile, seemed amused by the spectacle, getting their attention with a clap.
My. It seems both of you know each other. So allow me to introduce myself. You may call me Moonchild, and I welcome you to my home.
She spoke with surprisingly fluent Ogronen.
"Thank you,"
Norio said tensely.
"Why are they here?"
We had matters to discuss with Silex. I had originally planned to invite you here anyway, but after recent events, I figured this would be a good way of smoothing things out between us,
replied Moonchild.
"There are great,"
began Charles, before being abruptly interrupted.
"You would have me make peace with them? After all they've done?"
growled Norio.
If we are all to survive this, then yes. But I can appreciate that may be difficult at the present moment.
Moonchild began.
I am certain Charles regrets his actions greatly. But if there is anything that can be done to settle this matter, do let it be known, and it will be arranged.
Norio thought for a moment, pondering his options.
"A duel," he said sternly. "We will settle this with a duel. One warrior against another. Prove to me that you do not share your men's cowardice."
An indignant look spread over Charles's face. "Fine. Name your conditions."
"In mine homeland, a duel between an Ogroni and a human would be settled by first blood. That is the rule we will play by."
Splendid!
Gushed Moonchild.
Now that is decided, let us begin.
With a click of her fingers, a strange light surrounded Norio. When it cleared, he found himself alone in a strange place. A labyrinthine mess of pipes, harsh lights, and loud machinery. Even though there were no signs of his foe, Norio trod carefully. While he was confident he could win the duel in a fair fight, he also suspected that his opponent would be aware of this fact too, and would try to avoid such a clash. Norio worked his way through the facility, rigorously checking where he thought the king could be hiding before coming to a door. An ajar door. A mistake? Or a trap? He approached cautiously, ducking to get through the door. Suddenly, with a crack and a sharp pain in his side, the king emerged, wriggling his way out of an unsuspecting group of pipes with a smoking gun in his hand. Norio put his hand to the wound and drawing back with a wince. The wound was already clotting, but the damage was done. With a similar sensation brought on by that strange light, they returned to where they had left. Charles marched off to celebrate. Kaeda and Naoki walked up to Norio, looking first at his face, pensive and cold, and then the wound at his side, the sight and smell of a fresh bullet wound telling a simple yet disappointing story. "What happened?" Kaeda asked, concern evident on his face.
Isn't it obvious that you've been cheated? Because they're all gutless mongrels!
Naoki replied, raising her voice to make her opinions known. The human crowd grew quiet as Charles turned to address them. "Your master was simply outmaneuvered. Nothing else to it," he said indignantly. Naoki growled, her teeth bared, ready to lunge at the little know-it-all. But a hand shot out to stop her. Norio's.
They think of us brutes, mindless beasts, unworthy of admiration or remorse. If you want revenge, prove them foolish.
He spoke in a calm voice. She opened her mouth to interject, but Kaeda spoke first.
He's right, you know. Anyway, we are guesting this place. And personally, I'd hate to be rude.
Naoki tried to present an air of calm, but the other Ogroni could tell plainly that she was still furious. Norio put a hand on her shoulder and drew in close.
I understand your anger, but it is wasted. You couldn't be angry at a viper for being venomous, and you shouldn't be angry at them for being cowardly. It is their nature.
She stared at her master for a moment. She understood. Not fully, but she understood. If the others are willing to tolerate them for a time, then she will as well. Smiles started to spread among the humans. Whatever their leader had told her had calmed her down.
Well, now that unpleasantness is over, if you'll follow me, we can get to the reason I brought you all here,
Moonchild declared, walking off, trailed by the others. King Charles XII had to admit, the food served within the Halls of Selene was of the highest quality he had ever tasted. The spread of meats cooked to perfection, perfectly cut vegetables, trays filled with the sweetest of fruits. It was enough to lift his spirits. His host certainly helped in that regard, for he was glad to be in the presence of regal company once more. Though he was shocked at the presence of the Ogroni, as they call themselves. But he was not going to let his men start a fight within the Moonchild's home. Such would be unbecoming of them. Which is why he found the duel to be a welcome distraction, even if that archer of theirs was dissatisfied with the outcome. But no matter. The time for conflict had passed for now. So as he took a bite of the mutton before him, he turned towards the Moonchild with a question on his lips. "I'm curious, How exactly did you come to encounter the Ogroni?
My dear Charles, the resources of Selene are expensive indeed. Tracking him down via drone was quite the simple task. And the rest is history, as they say.
The Ogroni leader, known as Norio, was quick to comment on this. Did she contact you in a similar matter? Hardly. Our encounter was direct. A face-to-face discussion, shortly after a brief misadventure in a rolling fog cloud. After all that happened, our journey was relatively uneventful, until contact was made with another party shortly after this place arrived above this forest. It was some band of humans in strange green armor. Norio raised an eyebrow in intrigue at this.
Was their leader a woman who spoke in a way that suggested a belief of superiority?
Why, yes, that is correct. Have you encountered them as well?
Yes. On the 4th day of our time here, we encountered a shrine which teleported us to a location we had previously set up camp, where we encountered members of the Lunar Pact who engaged us in hostage negotiations.
Interesting. She had demanded my sword in exchange for letting us pass. Like some kind of bridge troll from children's fairy tales. Honestly, if I wasn't amused by her bravado, I would have been highly offended. The Moonchild was curious about this new information, deigning to opt into the conversation.
My. This is certainly interesting. This Lunar Pact. Do either of you know what their intentions might have been with Silex, or the weapons they seem to be collecting?
To be quite honest, I thought their leader was some sort of eccentric collector. But she could have been seeking to rectify a tactical disadvantage. Norio then gave his own answer.
What her intentions are, we do not know. However, we were able to secure Silex in exchange for my sword.
So you were the one she spoke of. She presented your sword to me in a display of bravado.
May I ask you something? For what reason did you surrender your own sword?
To have fought over the blade would have been an absurd waste of lives and ammunition, doing little but stroking egos. So I humored her delusions. At this, his mind couldn't help but go back to that conversation with the captain. How the battle with the Ogroni took place because he let his bruised ego dictate his actions. A mistake he would not make again. His thoughts were interrupted by the Moonchild.
I must commend both of you. Your diplomatic skills must be truly something to behold. Speaking of, it would certainly be an amusing sight to see her try to wield a courtier's blade.
Having seen it firsthand in their previous encounter, King Charles couldn't help but chuckle as she turned to Norio.
By the way, you have now seen my home. Perhaps you could tell me about yours.
The Ogroni happily went into detail regarding his homeland, speaking of its beauty, the wildlife, and the humans that live in it. Their host listened with fascination until Norio finished speaking.
Sounds like a wonderful place. I do hope to visit someday. But I must warn you, some of my fellow courtiers are far less pleasant. Speaking of less pleasant matters, the process to bring my home here was far messier than I would have liked. Having to engage the Theos Titanos in battle. But I was able to make use of their services afterwards, despite their rude manners. For their aid was crucial in bringing the moon here, even if they spent the whole time being creepy to my mech.
Your mech? What of this mech?
Charles was quick to answer the question. When we encountered her, she was accompanied by some kind of iron beast. Such a creation is probably this mech spoken of.
It is a mix of bodyguard and proxy body, an extension of my own will. And recently, the forest seems to be affecting it. The plants seeking to swarm its systems. Have either of you experienced anything similar regarding the forest?
There has been a presence, an influence, which has been weighing down on me and my men. We don't know what it is specifically, only that it is tied to this forsaken forest, and that it feels wrong. Norio acknowledged the statement with a nod before giving his own answer.
My own party had recently encountered residents of the forest, known as the Sisters Simulacrum. Their power was enough to easily overpower us and break my sword. However, their generosity was just as great, agreeing to aid us in their unique way.
A nod of understanding came from the Moonchild before her attention turned towards Silence.
And what of you? What are your thoughts on this place?
All eyes turned to the being responsible for everyone being summoned to this forest, though he remained mostly unbothered as a response was given.
The willow is supposed to be a key fixture of the Fangor. However, it has become twisted, asking too much of the system and threatening the balance of the multiverse. The willow is to blame for everything that has transpired here.
Based on the information presented, may I ask what you plan to do with him, Charles?
The question was met with a subtle sigh as the king answered. The plan was to bring him to the willow, but recent events have made me question if that is the best course of action. Norio responded to the statement with a tone of warning in his voice.
I can guarantee you that the willow is not to be trusted. It uses faith, weaponizes it against those who trust it, to do what is in its favor.
Silex quickly interjected at this moment, bringing attention back to him.
May I propose an alternative? Perhaps a partnership is in order. The willow cannot be destroyed, per se, but it can be replaced. If someone were to assume the role of the willow, they would be able to work with me and fix the Fangor.
A pondering silence met his proposal, leaving him to make a final remark.
I'll give you some time to think about it. In the meantime, those cakes are looking delicious.
The Moonchild looked out at her gathered guests, the regal Caroleans, the honorable Ogroni, and the ever enigmatic Silex, all making small talk and acting as picturesque guests within her mighty home. She couldn't help but wonder how much of it was down to basic courtesy and how much of it was the subtle displays of power. She filed the thought, something to think on in the quieter times to come. But for now, she forced a smile and joined in the pleasantries, waiting for the right time to act. With the meal over, the gathered guests moved into a grand ballroom to mingle and entertain themselves with the various facilities within Selene. It was here the Moonchild sprung into action, using the duties of the host to glide conspicuously between the groups. she passed a message over to the gathered leaders, ever careful to avoid the great unknown that was Silex. Even the name was a puzzle, bearing no resemblance to any other name on the court's extensive records and deep scans showing constant metaphysical changes. Just what are you, Silex? She scolded herself. Now was not the time for that. With messages delivered, she set up the central spire room, arranged the proper furniture, and ensured the gene lock was set to accept only the leaders and herself. With preparations made, the Moonchild donned her newest accessory and waited for admittedly less time than she had expected. The first to arrive was Charles, as dignified as ever, followed shortly by Norio, who, if the noises outside and the disgruntled looks were anything to go by, had some trouble figuring out the mechanics of the door. An odd sight met both. The woman who had invited them up here was present, but atop her head sat a helmet, made of bone knitted together by some kind of mechanical string, and fashioned into the form of a wolf's skull. The two took their seats, clearly marked by size, and waited for the host to speak. When the Moonchild only seemed to spasm on occasion, Norio took the lead.
Well, first things first. Will replacing the Willow be a permanent role?
I presume so, and it's not something I'm set on, she answered, an oddly masculine echo to her voice, taking the two by surprise. She turned to the king, awaiting an answer. Well, I would rather avoid damning myself to being trapped here for however long it takes. But if it means the safety of Sweden, then I will do it, he replied. She awkwardly turned to the Hatamoto.
That treacherous thing used me. Used all of us. If it means its ultimate defeat, my fellows and I would happily give our lives, he said. The thoughts of what the two would do with the forest, how they would turn it to their homeland's advantage, sent her twin personalities racing for a solution. With a string of words forged for maximum effect and a look to unsettle their souls, she spoke.
I would propose another solution. Silex clearly has an angle and can't be trusted. But the same is true of the Willow. I would seek to rule the Fangmoor and would grant any who aid me whatever boon is within my power.
The prospect clearly blindsided the pair, but she couldn't let them object.
Regardless, the first step of doing so would be to create a tool capable of cutting down the Willow. For while it stands, any plan to help the Fangmoor is doomed to fail.
A silence hung in the air for a moment, each leader deep in thought. The king spoke first. I had considered using gunpowder to blow it to smithereens, but such an act could only be done with the stores of the entire nation. Even then, transporting and setting it up would be anything but subtle. Moonchild nodded in agreement. The less the Willow knew of their plan, the better.
Whether Silex can be trusted and who will aid him in recovery are secondary. The Willow is the greater threat here, and destroying it is a must, started Norio,
causing the Moonchild's face to subtly sink.
But I must ask if such a tool need be made. It is a tree, and though it still pains me to say it, surely it can burn.
She thought on it for a moment. It wasn't favorable, but if it focused the Willow on others, she was willing to humor it.
Fire would perhaps work. However, I fear that it would be necessary to play by the rules of the Fangmoor. I have already begun to bend it to my will through engineered titles and symbolic acts. If we seek to burn the willow, we must find the fire in ritual.
Or bring in one who can create fire in such a way.
Norio began. Someone equally capable and disagreeable immediately sprang to Moonchild's mind.
There is one within his court, but to bring her here would be unpleasant,
she said, sour memories filling her mind and a mad grin filling her face. You have a history with them? Asked Charles.
I do. She was my tutor for a time. She acts as an enforcer and alchemist. Our time together was less than ideal,
she replied, choosing her words carefully. The Ogroni, who had been as still as a rock the entire time, finally spoke up.
There are monks in my homeland, dedicated to Nero Como, the god of fire. I am confident that they could create such a flame.
Would they willingly aid us?
Moonchild asked, more out of courtesy than anything else. Push come to shove, that can be forced. But she preferred not to make another enemy, especially one who knew so much of Selene.
I am confident that I can convince them, should the need arise. If nothing else, their knowledge of smithing will be invaluable,
he replied, to approving nods from the others.
Then I believe we have a plan,
the Moonchild said with a clap.
Whilst you retrieve the necessary aid, Charles and I shall defend and distract Silex.
Charles responded with a modest smile. However, the Ogroni wore a troubled look.
Is there a problem?
She asked.
My only problem is getting back to Hytora. I know not of a means of leaving this place, given where we are.
I trust you know of a means, he said.
There are a few rifts within Selene which allow for travel, though they route through the Void Sea. The journey will be traumatic,
she replied, drawing the final word out with a little chuckle, causing concern to spread across the other leader's face. After a tense moment, Norio spoke up.
If there are no other options, then the decision is made for us.
And with that, the gathered leaders got up, the plan set, their fates decided.